Hello and welcome back to the Rational Theology Podcast. I'm your host, LJ Sarman, and today I'm joined by my friend Cade Alvey, who's a fourth-year philosophy student. He just came over here to BYU from UVU. He's also co-host of the, what is it, like a podcast or a channel?
Podcast, YouTube.
Yeah, it's all those in favor. So I'll link it. Really good stuff. But yeah, so welcome.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and today we're going to be discussing, I think, at least what's to me a pretty interesting topic, kind of generally about atheism and some of its strongest arguments as presented by Alex O'Connor. So I'll link a video as well. It'll probably be beneficial to watch this video before watching the podcast or listening to the podcast, but you could also listen to the podcast without listening to the video because we'll be reading some quotes and stuff. But yeah, I mean, essentially we're responding to Alex O'Connor's video, This Is Why I Don't Believe in God, where he gives three, in my opinion, pretty strong arguments against theism. But yeah, we'll be discussing those and seeing how a Latter-day Saint approach can answer some of these questions. Yeah, so I guess first of all, we should probably define some of the relevant terms. So, Cade, what is atheism?
So it depends. The answer to this question depends on if you're on the internet or if you're at a university.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on the internet, they'll tell you it's like, oh, I just lack a belief in something. I just don't believe in God. I lack a belief in God. So it's kind of just this. It's not a negative or a positive position. It's just a neutral position. They're kind of able to tilt it that way if you're online. If you're at a university, that doesn't really hold up. Then no one really thinks that way at the university level. So at the university level, they'll say that you have this proposition that at least one God exists, and atheism is the rejection of that proposition. Theism is the assent to that proposition, and then agnosticism is neither accepting or rejecting the assent to the proposition or the negation of it. So you are just right there in the middle.
Yeah, right. And so I think there's kind of an important distinction between non-belief and disbelief, where I'd say disbelief is where you actively claim to not believe, and non-belief is more where you don't affirm it, but you don't necessarily deny the thing as well.
And sort of pejoratively, that view, the internet atheist definition, lack theism, as it's pejoratively been called. It doesn't, like Alex, when he's talking about atheism, he's not talking about lack theism. He might have been in the past, but I mean, he's really taken a turn after studying theology and philosophy academically. He actually had a full episode on it with Graham Oppy. I don't know if you know Graham Oppy. Graham's one of my favorite atheist philosophers. He's fantastic. And he's like very against this view that atheism is just a lack of belief in something. But
yeah. And so I guess to give some context, the guy whose arguments we're talking about today, his name is Alex O'Connor. He's a British YouTuber, philosopher. I think, how recently did he graduate from Oxford?
It's been a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, so he graduated from Oxford with a dual degree in philosophy and theology. And so he used to be a pretty online vocal, like new atheist, but now he's kind of made the flip to be more of an agnostic. And I think he's described himself as like an aggressive agnostic.
Militant agnostic.
Yeah, right, to where he's like, he really does a good job, in my opinion, of challenging certain atheist beliefs and conceptions, but also at the same time challenging certain theist beliefs and conceptions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And the clip that we're discussing comes from his debate with, I forget who the debate was with.
I think Jonathan Pageau. I'm not sure how to say his name.
Was it? It was a guy that is some sort of a biology professor in England somewhere.
Oh, that's not Jonathan then. So, must be from a different video.
Yeah. But regardless, essentially, briefly, in the 20-minute clip, he gives three arguments that he uses to describe why he doesn't affirm a belief in God. And so he talks about J.L. Schellenberg's Hiddenness Argument. He talks about the geographical likelihood of being a believer, and he talks about gratuitous suffering and kind of the problem of evil a little bit. And we'll get into what all these mean in a second. But I think if you've seen the video, then you know that he starts with reading a passage from the Psalms. And he reads Psalm 139, 7 through 10. And let me pull that up real quick just so we can read it. And Cade, do you have any thoughts on kind of his use of this scripture before?
I mean, I think you're going to find some embellishment in just about any Old Testament scripture you dig into. So to say that this, I mean, obviously the philosophical case that God should not be hidden is probably better than the scriptural one. And this was probably more of a rhetorical use of the passage. I don't think this passage is necessarily saying that no matter what, anyone who seeks God will find him in all scenarios and every time they simply request a divine interaction. So, I mean, some people might take it to be that way, but I think they would be a little more careful just to kind of say that this is a rhetorical use of the verse, not an actual hermeneutical exploration of what the verse is saying.
Yeah, right. And so if you didn't watch the video, then Psalm 139, 7 through 10 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." So essentially, right, just the psalmist talking about how God is so present, he can't go. He goes to heaven, he's there. Sheol, he's there. He can't escape kind of the spirit of God or whatever.
The psalmist was obviously alive before, like the DMV and stuff. If he was, I think he would reconsider if he ever had to experience standing in line at the DMV or any government entity for that matter, the post office.
Yeah.
God is nowhere to be found.
No. Yeah. So, I just wanted to talk about that first because I think part of Alex's argument becomes a little stronger because of his rhetorical use of this psalm, which itself isn't an argument, but he kind of just appeals to the fact that, I really wish I could have this experience, which is understandable, right? But it doesn't, I don't think it should count as an argument in itself. Yeah.
But as you mentioned, he gets it from J.L. Schellenberg, the Hiddenness Argument. It's, a lot of people actually think it's like stronger than the problem of evil.
That's, my opinion. Yeah.
And it's really interesting. It's a really interesting argument.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never read Schellenberg's whole book. I know you have.
I just finished it yesterday. So
yeah, he's great. He's excellent. I've never read the full book. I read excerpts, and I am familiar with the argument. But basically what it's saying is that if God existed, you would expect that there is never such thing as a non-resistant non-believer. So someone who's open to having a relationship with God, but can't seem to find any sort of belief in him, and that exists.
Yeah.
Supposedly on this argument, there's a lot of Christians who would probably say no, but I don't think that's super plausible. So we're in a spot where we have people who are open to the idea that God exists, but they just can't get there. They just can't get there to find faith in God.
Yeah, and I think it's important because the kind of the crux of the argument is if non-resistant non-belief exists, if people who are fine with accepting that a God exists exist who at the same time do not believe in God. Like, I guess a simpler way to put it is, for example, Alex has really sought out God. He wants God to exist, even, he claims, but he doesn't believe in God because he doesn't find sufficient reason to, or he's never had a personal sort of spiritual experience with a God that would lead him to that belief. And so I think it's important to contrast this with resistant belief, or resistant non-belief rather. And Alex talked about a statistic in the video where there was a poll by an atheist YouTube channel that said, if a God existed, would you worship it? And 85% of respondents said they would not worship a God if it turned out that there was one. So that's an example of resistant non-belief, to where it's, even if there is a God, I would not want to believe in that God. I wouldn't worship that God. And so this is not non-resistant non-belief, because in non-resistant non-belief, this is talking about people who either have never even thought about God and thus don't believe in God, or people that do want to believe in God or are fine with it, but just don't believe in God because they don't have sufficient reason, or have never had certain experiences to lead them to a belief in God. So, and I guess I can kind of state the formal argument, and this is a pretty analytic way to put this here. It's a valid deductive argument. So essentially, if the premises are true, then the conclusion which, spoiler alert, is God does not exist, is true. And so we're not going to be trying to say that this is an invalid argument. It's a valid argument. We're just going to be probably challenging some of the premises. So premise one is, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. Premise two is, if there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. Premise three is, if a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 4, some finite persons are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 5, no perfectly loving God exists. 6, if no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. 7, God does not exist. So, yeah. What do you say?
So, and this, I'm not going to just say that I have like a knockdown proof of this, or like a knockdown debunking of this argument or anything, because it's been around for a long time, and obviously so. It's very, very, very pressing in the topic of philosophy, religion, and epistemology more generally. But I think where I would start, at least, is to say that it's sort of like this, it's sort of like the responses to the problem of evil, in that you can say that God has reasons for not fully revealing himself to anyone or a given person at a given time. So there's an example. I think Michael J. Murray uses it. He says, I think it was Michael J. Murray. He says he talks about this girl who's always she's always abused, and she has this terrible life, and all of the authority figures in her life are just unbelievably cruel to her. And he says if this girl was just sort of imbued with, at some point, just kind of woke up to the fact that God existed, she would likely think that God is like the other authority figures in her life and is cruel and unjust and evil. So this is a scenario in which someone could say that God revealing himself to this person would cause more harm than good. If God revealing himself fully in that moment is going to cause this little girl to have this fearful relationship with him, then he's not going to do it. And I think that's where I go back to, as a Latter-day Saint especially, and we'll talk about this a little more when we talk about the contingency of religious beliefs and religious diversity, but where I'd go back to is the fact that God is going to do whatever is within his power to produce not just knowledge that he exists, but a loving relationship, as the argument says. And what produces a loving relationship isn't always going to be a full reveal of himself. He's going to do it slowly, and he's going to do it in the way that will best benefit that person. So I mean, I can think of tons of different situations where I look back on my experiences, and I can kind of see that God was guiding me in a way. And I didn't realize it at the beginning, because I probably wouldn't have been ready for that full experience of what God is revealing to me. So, and this reminds me, so at UVU, I was one of a couple theists in the entire philosophy department.
Oh, really?
And we were reading the last book of Plato's Republic. And for anyone who's read it, they'll remember that it just gives, it's like this kind of rocky dialogue for like the whole entire book. It's like, yes, it is Socrates. Why, yes, Socrates. And it just keeps going. And then in that last book, it just like all of a sudden stops, and it starts flowing as like one continuous wall of text. And it just gives this beautiful description of like the afterlife, and like what is truly just, and how the afterlife is going to be truly just, and all the souls are getting what they deserve, and all the souls are finally being sorted into what is right, where they want to be. And I remember in class, everyone gets there, we're asking my professor, his name is Mike Shaw, he's an excellent, like brilliant Plato scholar, one of the best in the world. And everyone's asking, like, what does it mean? What does it mean? Like, what was the original, like, what was the context? And I kind of, like, I was just so moved by this that I asked, I was like, did anyone else just feel, like, really moved by this last chapter? And, like, no one in the class even realized it, but they were like, you know what? Now that you mention it, like, absolutely. And this was like a class of, I mean, very, some of them very militant atheists. And they were able to say, like, yeah, I did. I was very moved by it. And I couldn't help but think that maybe one day, if they were to come to the truth, if they were to come to belief in God, or let's say belief in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, they would look back on that experience reading Plato's Republic, where the three souls, or the three types of souls, are sort of sorted into their perfect place and their just spot where they want to be. And they'll say, maybe that was God. That moving experience I had with Plato's Republic was God nudging me in the right direction.
Hmm.
And sometimes you can't see that until you're looking back on it. And and this is another area. Sorry if I'm yapping, but this is another area where
Good.
LDS theology sort of has an upper hand. Is if you accept the existence of the spirit world and the possibility that people can accept God and Jesus Christ after this life, then that sort of dissolves this problem a little bit.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get all the way there and you die and you go to spirit prison and you can look back on those experiences that you had and realize that they were actually divine,
Hmm.
and you eventually do make that decision, then obviously, due to better epistemic circumstances, you're going to be helped to believe in God. So if we have this like extra
Yeah.
layer on the problem
Right.
where people are given more opportunity to experience God in better epistemic circumstances after having received their body and doing the necessary growing that's required to be exalted. But for Christians who don't believe in that sort of redemption or possibility of redemption in the next life, I do see how it's an incredibly pressing problem. If there's
Hmm.
just this 90-year period on Earth where you have to be epistemically available to have a relationship with God, then I can definitely see how it's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think a lot of atheist arguments kind of hinge on the fact that salvation has to be decided. Like you have to figure out how to get saved before you die. But kind of the LDS conception of the spirit world, which if you don't know what that is, essentially we believe that after this life, after we die, we kind of go to I think of it as like a waiting room. And so essentially the spirits that were saved and figured out about Jesus and stuff go to one spot, and then those everybody else goes to another spot. And so essentially there's another layer of another chance to accept, or a first chance to accept the the ideas of Christianity and the church and stuff. And so there's teaching that goes on between the people who never accepted it and those who did. And so I think just this idea that there's death isn't the end in terms of salvation kind of helps out a lot with certain atheistic arguments, and I think it helps here. But I'm curious, do you affirm the fact that there is non-resistant non-belief?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah,
think there's
as do
absolutely no.
I. I've known a lot of people who are non-resistantly in a state of non-belief. And so, I've heard a lot of Christian arguments that, oh no, non-resistant non-belief doesn't even exist. And I think it's Paul in Romans or somewhere talks about how that there's enough evidence everywhere to know that God exists. And I think maybe that may have been true for certain times or cultures where kind of belief in God was the norm, and based on other things. But I'd say at least for now, we kind of live in a world where it's quite difficult to believe in God. There's not a lot of just miracles going on out in the open these days, and just kind of our society is quite secular, and so people are just naturally raised in places where belief in God is not only not a thing, it's looked down upon.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I think I do affirm non-resistant non-belief. And so I'd say my problem isn't with that premise necessarily. I think it's with his premise of and his definition of what a perfectly loving God is. And so he kind of talks about in the book that a perfectly loving God would be open to relationship with finite persons, or in other words, us, at any moment in time. And so he says that there is no greater good that can be conceived justify God not being in relationship with people, for during a mortal probation or otherwise. And so he says if there's a truly perfectly loving God, then he would be always open to a relationship. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't say that God always has to be in a relationship with people, but he just has to be open. So that if somebody asks to have a relationship with God in whatever way that might be, God doesn't decline or God isn't silent. And so one of the ways I've thought to get around this is I'm not sure I would term it a greater good, but I'd say kind of the whole reason, at least in LDS theology for us coming here, is this is some type of a test. And so also in LDS theology, right, there's a premortal life, and we existed in some capacity with God, and there came a point where we couldn't necessarily progress anymore. Our relationship with God, our ability to have like a whole relationship with God, kind of hit a wall. And so because of that, and I think part of that was because we knew God existed, we knew about his presence. And so in order to continue to be in communion with God, to be in fellowship with God, it's kind of like an analogy I've thought about is it's kind of, at least in terms of doing right and wrong, right? Like if you have a father and a child, and the child, let's say, doesn't do a bad thing. What's like a bad thing? I don't know, like a child who likes to write on walls, right? Which is a bad thing, right? The child doesn't write on walls in the presence of his parents, but let's say the parents leave and then he writes on walls. That's kind of his true desires becoming manifest, if that makes sense. And so in that state, we had that parental figure there. And so because of that, we might not have been making decisions exactly as we would in our most true form. And that's not the best way to put it, but that's kind of an analogy I've thought of. And so essentially, in order to test whether we are actually interested in a whole and perfectly loving relationship with God, we needed to have a period of time in which we could not be certain that a God existed, because then, the way I see it, if we make a good decision, it's not just to appease God or whatever. We do the decision because we actually, I guess a better purpose, we want to make that decision. And so I guess God wants us to be good, not just to be good, but because we want to be good, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would just kind of add to the problem of divine hiddenness. I would just kind of add two propositions to the mix. And it's definitely up for debate how that kind of shakes up the argument. But I would add that there are reasons that God could withhold his full self from individuals at any specific time in their journey that would be totally justified, because it would be the best possible thing to eventually get them to enter into a loving relationship, not one of fear or not one of contempt or anything like that. So that's the first proposition, that there could be ways in which God doesn't reveal himself that lead to better ultimate relationships. And two, that people have the opportunity under better epistemic conditions in the spirit world to enter into a relationship with God. I think that I'm sure brilliant atheists could come up with some way to keep the problem alive, but I think that definitely dissolves it quite a bit.
Yeah. And also his whole argument doesn't entirely apply to the LDS God or certain conceptions of the LDS God, because he kind of tries to define like a deity that would apply to every religion. And so he kind of talks about ultimism, and he says that his deity that he's addressing is soteriologically ultimate, which means that we depend entirely on our salvation depends on this being, which I'd say that goes along with LDS God. He says that the being must be axiologically ultimate. I'm not going to lie, I kind of forgot what that one meant, but I think he meant that being was like the most important. I'm not even going to try. I forgot what that one meant. And the last one was the being must be metaphysically ultimate. And I think what he meant by that was essentially the being must be kind of like the reason for existence, and kind of everything that exists is because of him. And to an extent, that's true in LDS theology. But I think the main one that kind of matches with, and if I remember correctly, the axiological one didn't apply to our God. But
I need to read that book.
yeah, it's a good book. Um, but yeah, essentially, I'd say we are soteriologically dependent on God, um, but in the Mormon conception, kind of the his argument misses, I think, because in order to be in the highest form of relationship with God, this period is necessary, because God is not ultimate in the ways he is in classical theism. And so I think this argument is a little stronger for a classical theist God than it
Yeah.
is for our God, because in the question for classical theists would be, well, if God could just, if the ultimate purpose for our life is to be one with God, to be in perfect communion, loving communion with God, then why didn't God just create everybody in that state to begin with? And that's, I think, a hard question to answer. It's not without its answers, but for LDS, we can say, well, God didn't originally create, our essence, our intelligence, and so he's kind of having to deal with pre-existing conditions, and so he does the best he can. We still affirm that he's omnipotent, although that might be defined slightly differently. But he's working with different conditions than the classical theist God is. And so in order to enter into the highest form of relationship, the highest, most perfect union with God, this period was necessary as, among other things, kind of a test to see if we would do, I think it's in Abraham, right? It says, we'll prove them herewith to see if they'll do all the things whatsoever the Lord their God commands them, right? So it's kind of a test to see if who qualifies to enter into that perfect relationship with God. Because also different in LDS theology a little bit is the end goal of everything is deification, is exaltation, is to become one with God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, to become as they are, not just in name, but in being as well. So
Yeah. And just before we go on to the next issue, I would just kind of maybe take a little bit of a pastoral angle on this. There's this narrative in the New Testament where Christ is on the cross, and he says, kind of out of nowhere. I remember it was kind of confusing to me as a kid. He was like, "Oh, Father, why have you forsaken me? Like, where'd you go?"
mm-hmm.
And our leaders, Jeffrey R. Holland specifically, have kind of interpreted that to mean that if Jesus is to experience everything that we experience in order
Mm-hmm.
to be our Savior, he had to experience a withdrawal of the Father's presence.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first moment on the cross where he, right before he died, felt that withdrawal of the
Mm-hmm.
Father's presence. So you could kind of take this isn't going to be a super philosophically rigorous view, but you could kind of take this pastoral angle where you say Christ shared in that suffering of being separated from the Father so that he can kind of reconcile us to the Father through his own
Mm-hmm.
atonement. And that's kind of like probably how our church leaders would reply to this question. And logically, it might not be the strongest, but I think sort of at this deep religious and intuitive level, a lot of people find a lot of solace in that fact
Mm-hmm.
that Christ as well was separated from the Father. And this isn't going to bring any atheist to belief, but if there is a theist that is struggling with this issue,
Mm-hmm.
they're probably going to take some comfort knowing that Christ and repentance can help them to remove that hiddenness, kind of
Mm-hmm.
remove that barrier.
Yeah.
But we can go on. I'll be done.
No, yeah, that's I think that's a great point. And in kind of my conversion, one of the greatest spiritual experiences of my life was in hearing, I think it was actually Elder Holland in his 2009 talk, go through that story and talk about where Christ is on the cross and he's just paid the sins of humanity, and he cries out in his final moments, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that really just spiritually really, really hit me, that Christ, who had done no evil, even he was deprived of the presence of God for a time. And I just finished Blake Ostler's volume 4 of Exploring Mormon Thought
Excellent.
yesterday, and he mentions how, and this is I'd never thought about this, how Christ in just previously in his intercessory prayer and in the Garden of Gethsemane had been as one with the Father as he had ever been, and to go from that to have the Father utterly withdraw from the Son. He went from the highest, the most close he had been to the Father to as far as he had ever been in just a moment. And I think that was also pretty, um, you know, I don't know the right word for it, but it was moving, I guess, is a good word for it. But
Mm.
yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, so yeah, Alex's second argument is what he calls the geographical statistical arrangement of religious belief. It's hard to find a good wording for it, but more or less what he means is, I'll read a couple quotes here. He says, "How likely you are to be a theist is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born." And he goes on to ask the Christian guy he's debating, "Is it not troubling that your place of birth, which is entirely arbitrary, is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved?" So, I mean, I think that is troubling. I've, I came to this atheistic argument before even listening to him give it. I think it's pretty. I just, I've lived in a lot of places, and in all the places I've lived, I've really thought about how it doesn't seem fair that how come some people are born Christians, some people born LDS, some people born in places where they're just very not likely to even hear about Christ, other places where they're likely to reject Christ. And so, what are your thoughts initially on this?
So I think maybe I just was misunderstanding him, but I'm really shocked that Alex didn't catch that this is an argument against Christianity, but it doesn't apply to theism.
Mm-hmm.
Like his language where he says like where you're born is a statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved. That really is only a critique against like
Yeah,
a very traditional Christian
yeah,
worldview.
yeah. And I guess it might be good to clarify. Yes, you can be a theist without believing in the Christian God, right? For example, Hindus are theists, right? But they don't believe in the Christian God. And so a lot of these arguments kind of do go down Christian rabbit holes just naturally. We're in the West, everybody's Christian or not. So, but yeah.
And that's another thing too is I was really shocked. I mean, a lot of people share this sentiment, so there could be a really good reason why I'm wrong. But he says that I think he gives what is it, Singapore or something like that as
Uh-huh.
a
Or like
example.
Thailand or something.
Thailand, where the majority, like 90% of people, are Buddhists,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, well, that's an atheistic religion. They don't believe in God, and I sort of just reject
Yeah,
that. Like, I mean,
that's not
belief in God is
good.
definitely available to them. I would say
Yeah.
it's even probably probable. Like, if you ask them if they believe in God, they'd probably say yes.
Yeah.
And so I really think this actually hurts his case for atheism. If you have all these tremendously different cultures that all have this belief in some sort of supernatural or transcendent
Mm-hmm.
thing or things,
Yeah.
then that really kind of hurts the atheist naturalist worldview in in a lot of ways. Like if they were like if you can kind of flip the contingency argument on its
Yeah.
head and say like, oh well, if it's contingent on our culture, then why does every single person pretty reliably believe
Yeah.
in some kind of god?
Right.
So there's also this is a really interesting area of philosophy of religion. Thomas Bogardus has a really good paper on it,
Okay.
and there's a couple other papers I can maybe send him to you. You can put them in
Yeah, that'd be good.
the description. But he one paper kind of summarizes how Plantinga and Swinburne and other famous religious philosophers will sort of engage with the problem of religious diversity. But just to kind of get it out of the way first, it's not an argument against theism. I don't think. I don't think it works
Mm-hmm.
against theism. It makes theism more likely. But if we want to
Yeah.
take the argument, maybe
Against
alter a little
Christianity.
bit
Mm-hmm.
and maybe just apply to Christianity or something
Yeah.
like that, there's a version of the argument called the bare counterfactual argument,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically just saying like if sorry, I have the premises right here. It's just a two premise argument. If you had been born and raised somewhere else, then you would have had different religious beliefs. And then the conclusion from that premise is basically that your religious beliefs don't count as genuine knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Like if your beliefs are entirely contingent on what family you grew up in or what country you grew up in, then you can't have genuine knowledge. I just think that sounds really implausible on its face.
Mm-hmm.
And Plantinga has a really good response, and he's like, "Well, I was born in Michigan, and I believe that I was born in Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
because I was born in Michigan. That doesn't, like, if I was born in Madagascar, I would not have believed I was born in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, my belief, for me, to apply it to me, my belief that I was born in Utah comes from the fact that I was born in Utah. But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that I don't have knowledge.
Uh-huh.
It's even though it's entirely contingent.
Right.
There's, I don't think this is what Alex is saying, though. And I don't think this is
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of the people that advocate this argument are saying, at least in the academic space. It's
Yeah.
probably, you'll probably see something like this on an Instagram comment or something.
Yeah.
But if you sort of take the view Alex seems to be advocating, is he's like, well, we would expect, if Christianity were true, that it would just kind of be a random distribution of people that believe in Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
and that your family you grew up in, or the country you grew up in, or society doesn't have a huge effect on how likely you are to believe in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a really good argument against Christianity.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
But and maybe I'm just overstating this, but the First Presidency statement on God's love for all of humanity is one of the best, most important documents that the church has ever put out. And I'm just baffled that we don't read it more, and that we
Yeah.
don't quote it more.
I don't even recognize that. What's it?
You could, yeah, maybe pull it up. It's
What year is it?
oh, it's 70s, I think. It's pretty old, but it's this document where the church basically finds this, like, this is totally divine for me. This document is so important because it finds this perfect middle ground, in my view, between pluralism, where every religious claim has equal merit,
Mm-hmm.
and exclusivism, where all of the religious claims outside of yours are just wrong
Yeah.
and have no merit. So like a Protestant will say, like, you'll see them, they'll show up in your comments probably, and they'll say, this is heresy,
Yeah.
which they don't get that that's just saying, like, oh, that's not what I believe. It's
Right.
like, yeah, duh,
Yeah.
it's different. But they don't, that this principle, this exclusivism principle manifesting itself, is it's like, oh, well, this is not outside, or this is outside of what I believe. Therefore, it's wrong and you're going to hell because of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge problem. If you have people in Japan that are Buddhist or some other religion, very overwhelmingly, due to growing up in Japan, it's a huge problem for Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't take that view. And pluralism has its own issues. But this view, Blake Ostler has this great fair speech years and years and years ago, where he talks about religious experience as the ground for belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
And he labels our view religious inclusivism. So it's not
Yeah.
pluralism and it's not exclusivism.
Yeah.
And this document is like the perfect endorsement of it. And yeah, I'll just read that part right there. It says, the great religious leaders of the world, such as Muhammad, Confucius, the reformers, as well as philosophers, including Socrates, Plato, and others, received a portion of God's light. Moral truths were revealed to them, and by God, to enlighten whole nations and bring a brighter level of understanding to individuals. That just blows me away. That is like so divine for me,
Yeah.
because the principle behind that is basically, if you are a Hindu and you grow up believing that God looks like this elephant, or God looks like this or that and the other, God isn't going to say, well, you're wrong, no more divine communication for you. He's going to communicate with that individual how they're going to best understand it and what's going to best move them closer to him.
Yeah.
So this religious contingency argument, and it just really doesn't do much for me. It doesn't persuade me almost at all, because we just don't see this exclusivist world like Protestants do. We see this view where if a Catholic is going to have a vision of the Virgin Mary, that's totally fine, because if that's how God's going to get closer to someone, he's going to take that avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that cultures all across the world have religious experiences overwhelmingly supports that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this argument really, really hit me hard when I first discovered it, just by my own thinking, my own musings, but after I thought about it, I kind of realized that especially Mormonism has some very good provisions for dealing with it, like everything else we've talked about. But the way I see it, and in fact, I started writing a paper just for personal purpose, just personal satisfaction purposes. That I need to finish this, but kind of with a thesis about salvation, which is a little different than most people have heard, because obviously, unequivocally, we believe that the only way you can be saved is through Jesus Christ. There's no other name, no other head, nothing that you can be saved under. But that doesn't mean that you need to expressly accept Jesus, expressly accept the correct form of Christianity, at least in this life. And so, because kind of it poses a problem for Christianity if you must accept a very specific set of doctrines in this life, because even if we're talking like Roman Catholicism, like most Roman Catholics don't even know what they believe. And so it's like, if you have to, if salvation is based on just happening to be right about whatever theology you hold, then the vast majority of people who have ever existed are in a lot of trouble.
I'm probably cooked.
Right. Yeah. No, even if we're close, like we're still not,
Oh yeah.
we're not all the way on. And so kind of the way I see it though is salvation in Mormonism, to put it very simply, or at least to account for why so many people never encounter Christ, or why certain people die at young ages or things. The way I see it, salvation is based on one, how honestly you act according to the light you receive, and then two, how adamant you are in your search for new light. And
Yeah.
so I need to flesh this out more. I'm trying to get this put down in words, but essentially, it only seems fair to me that people are judged according to what they have honestly known or received, and honestly acted according to. And so, I don't know, because right, the people, like I guess we can use like Japan again. People in Japan aren't just like bad people or
Oh, of course
something.
not. Yeah.
No, it's they just happen to have not been placed in a culture, a time where belief in Christ is a super common thing, and so that doesn't pose a problem to the Mormonism's picture of soteriology or salvation, because we believe that this life is not just a test to see if you will accept Christ in a super specific sense. It's more a test to see if you will accept Christ in principle, if that makes sense. And so, if you will do the works of Christ, right? I've been reading First John a lot. I think First John is one of the best books of Scripture we have. But he says, "Little children, be not deceived. Those who do righteousness are righteous, even as He is righteous." Right. And so, I think obviously we need covenants. We need to specifically accept Christ. But because of the Mormon conception of the spirit world, this life can still function as a great learning experience, even without specific Christian doctrines.
Yeah. And if you gain those virtues, and if you gain a condition of your heart such that when you're in better epistemic conditions, you are able to accept Christ and accept all those covenants and ordinances, then that's you just became saved. Like if you
Yeah.
cultivate the state of heart required to do all that Christ asks and to accept Him as your Savior, whether that's in this life or the next, then mission accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
But like the contingency of where you grow up just doesn't really affect that. Like you can still, no matter where you're born, no matter what you're
Mm-hmm.
growing up in, and obviously there's going to be different difficulties. Like if you have an extremely mean, terrible family that raises you, it's going to be a lot harder to be loving and nice. But everyone's going to have that opportunity to cultivate those virtues in their life,
Yeah.
and everyone has the opportunity and the choice to create a state of heart that will be conducive to salvation, whether that's sooner or later. And also, I thought I'd share this. Is funny because this is a extremely old argument. Did you like Xenophanes, the pre-Socratic philosopher, hundreds of years before Christ, even before Socrates, as the name pre-Socratic hints
Yeah.
at? He says, if oxen and horses and lions had hands and were able to draw with their hands and do the same things as men, horses would draw the shapes of the gods to look like horses and oxen to look like oxen. Each would have made the gods' bodies the same shape as they themselves had. So he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, these people, like, if horses could conceive of God, they would think God was a horse.
Yeah.
Like people just believe what they are and what
Right.
they are conditioned to believe,
Yeah.
which has its own problems. But
Yeah.
I think it's funny how old this is. Like this
Yeah.
has come up time and time again for a really long time. And then this is my last 2 cents, then we can move on to the last point. But there's two kind of questions here. One of them is the epistemological question, and one is like the ontological question.
Mm-hmm.
So part of this question is saying, can you have justified belief in God if it's contingent based on where you grow up or where you're from? And the other is like the ontological question, like, does the diversity in religious conviction make God's existence less likely?
Yeah.
Or make Christianity less likely? And the question of epistemology is a little bit more interesting for me because I just think the question of like the question of if it makes Christianity less plausible or theism less plausible just doesn't really make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I'll keep this super short, but basically what this is endorsing is a view in epistemology called sensitivity or safety.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be right. Let's say I was raised a Christian because I was born in a Christian family, in a Christian community, in a Christian country. People would say that, well, you could have been born somewhere else. So that means you can't really have knowledge. And they don't realize that this is a condition for knowledge that isn't really accepted in epistemology. Like it's not super popular.
Okay.
And there's a really famous example of this clock. Let's say we had a clock right here, and it's extremely accurate. We always have good reason to trust it. And it's an atomic clock.
Yeah.
The only thing that can get this clock to fail is if there's some atomic force that interrupts it. Little did we know, this atomic clock, if it's within 200 feet of another big atomic force, it becomes inaccurate. So we're looking at the clock, and it says 3 o'clock. We're justified in believing that it's 3 o'clock. But as the thought experiment goes, we have this atomic force that's 201 feet away. So like remarkably close to causing us to get our belief that it's 3 o'clock incorrect. Does the safety of our belief, does that affect whether we have knowledge of the time or not? And most people say no. Like if you look at the clock, it's always reliable, and it says 3 o'clock, and it actually is 3 o'clock, then you have knowledge that it's 3 o'clock. Whether or not there's an atomic force that almost prevented you from believing that it's 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how Thomas Bogardus goes about
That's interesting.
answering this question.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess just to add, just the last thing for this point, I have a couple Brigham Young quotes.
I love it.
Always good to whip out a couple Brigham Young quotes. Maybe not always, but and so I think just to address some certain misconceptions or whatever, like one thing we often hear, I think, especially as young people engaged with apologetics and other things, is that Mormonism is a works-based gospel, and so if you get baptized a Mormon and you do the Mormon covenants, then you're saved and stuff, and that just grossly misunderstands salvation. And so in an 1862 discourse, Brigham Young said, a question was asked Joseph Smith if all would be damned except the Latter-day Saints. He answered, yes, and most of the Latter-day Saints, unless they repent and do better than they have done. And so kind of as a joke, he's talking about how salvation isn't, or I guess exaltation isn't dependent on what you do. You don't just check off boxes and then you can become one with God. Becoming one with God requires an actual metaphysical change in yourself, which you do as you embrace the atonement of Christ and the teachings of Christ. And just another quote. Hold on, I thought I had it.
It's an electric quote.
Yeah. Let's see.
Do you have a doc with all the discourses on it?
No, this is just my paper.
Oh my gosh.
I thought I had the quote in here though. Okay, yeah. Brigham Young also said, I do not care whether they be Christian, pagan, or Mohammedan. You should be living according to the best light you have. and if you do, you will receive all the glory you ever anticipated.
That's
So,
inclusivism, man.
yeah, I found that after I made my thesis, and I was like, oh, well, this literally is just my thesis.
I like
So,
it. It's perfect.
yeah. So, okay, to move on, the third point Alex brings up is a tough one, but it is the problem of gratuitous or meaningless suffering.
We're going to solve it right here in 10 minutes.
Yeah, we're gonna
Just off the
figure
rip.
get to the bottom of it. No, I'll read a quote here. He said, "The biggest problem for theism is not the great intense sufferings of the world like holocausts or earthquakes, but rather less significant menial suffering like being caught out in the rain or stubbing your toe or tripping over a curb on the street. What possible meaning could be found in stubbing your toe or tripping over a curb on the street or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul, nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan." He says a successful theodicy then, and Cade, what's a theodicy?
It's a description. It's like a defense of God, like making your case for why God's not a monster.
Right. A successful theodicy then needs not only to provide an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings that pervade the human experience. And then he also goes on to mention animal suffering, which is tough. But I think the first thing that kind of jumped out at me is he kind of admits to the power and coherence of soul making and free will theodicies.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and to this question, I sort of take a bare facts approach, where I just do what I did with the problem of divine hiddenness, and I add a couple propositions to the mix,
Mm-hmm.
and I just add these main ones. I say, one, we weren't created from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever evil or imperfections exist in the world, they weren't created that way from nothing. So God didn't just like snap his fingers and create me with a disease or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's at least, you can't at least blame God for everything because he didn't create everything from nothing the way it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then two, I add the preexistence. It's a huge one. I think this is like the most compelling and most beautiful part of our theology is the preexistence.
Yeah.
And I'm just shocked that it's not more popular
Right.
in other
I know,
faith traditions.
It's very interesting.
Because it seems to me that it has so much explanatory power and so little commitments. Like it's not like implausible on its face. It's not. There's no like really good counterfactual argument for why we didn't exist before this. It's reasonable to assume that if we exist now and will exist later forever, that we existed forever before, and it almost entirely dissolves a lot of these questions.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm not going to say it just like fixes the whole thing.
No.
But if you existed before this, you foresaw or were told or for whatever reason knew that there would be suffering, maybe even you knew the extent, or I'm assuming you knew the extent,
Yeah.
or the specifics of the suffering that you were going to enter into, and you consented to entering in the mortal experience anyway, that changes everything. Mm-hmm. You weren't, I mean, in the classical theism view, you were created from nothing. So I didn't ask to be created. I was just created from nothing and put right into a world with tons of suffering and evil. And that just sucks. I just have to deal with it. But on the LDS view, not only is the world created from nothing, I existed before. So I knew that the world was chaotic and evil and there was going to be suffering. And I entered into the universe anyway, into a mortal experience anyway. And then the third one I add is deification or exaltation, becoming like God. Mm-hmm. The mortal experience that we're in isn't just about, it's not just about like accepting Christ in this intellectual sense, like just understanding his sacrifice and just kind of assenting to the proposition that he's the savior. It's about becoming like him. And this is kind of what you were talking about in your paper, it sounds like, is we're here to cultivate the virtues required to return back home. So how does this apply to like stubbing your toe or those types of things that are seemingly not providing some greater good? This is where a topic or a subject called gnomic regularity comes in. Okay. I don't know if you've heard that.
No.
Okay. So gnomic regularity is basically this view. I think Blake Ostler talks about it a little bit in the 4th volume, but he doesn't name it. It might be a new name. But the idea is, in order to have suffering that does create soul building,
Uh-huh.
you have to have some sort of gnomic regularity within the world, which means that there is a certain level of chaos and there's a certain level
Yeah.
of this resistant matter.
Uh-huh.
Like if there wasn't this gnomic regularity.
Yeah, and I think gnomic comes from nomos Greek, which is law.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Like regularity of
No,
natural
yeah,
law.
he talked about that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So you, like if every time I stubbed my toe, if like my toe just like glided through
Yeah.
the material on the couch or whatever I'm kicking, then like the world wouldn't function such that we could have the soul building
Yeah.
properties of a immortal experience.
Yeah. Yeah, if I remember correctly, he kind of talked about if God was to stop every like instance of unjustified evil or whatever, then it would introduce such a confusion into the regular order of the world that like the soul building, the becoming a better person, just the whole meaning of life to some extent would go out the window because we couldn't even predict how certain things would take place. So
And here's an example. Let's say that I was a terrible, horrible person and I wanted to shoot you and kill you. You wouldn't gain anything from it. I wouldn't ever learn my lesson, and I was just going to go to jail and rot in prison and never learn.
yeah.
But if that is an unjustified, or it doesn't really help either of us, instance of suffering, and God just didn't allow unjustified suffering, I would pull the trigger and the bullets would like fall to the ground or something, or they would just like go through you. That doesn't allow us to be free in any morally relevant sense. I could still choose to try and kill you, but I just wouldn't be able to.
Right. Yeah.
So what, like, at what virtues would I be cultivating if whatever malice or there's no choice between good and evil in that case. There's no building of virtues that's required to become like God.
Yeah.
And if the purpose of this life is to become like God and to gain the virtues and characteristics that he has, then there has to be some way that that we're free in a morally relevant sense.
Right.
And I should clarify too, I don't even think gnomic regularity is required.
Yeah.
I think you can kind of take the 3 LDS propositions that I laid out and you can have a really confident position. You can say, yeah, well, there might be some unjustified suffering, or it might seem like there's unjustified suffering, but I chose to come here knowing that God didn't make it that way from nothing and that it would be for my good in the end. So, and Alex talks about this all the time. He's like, yeah, if I just kind of like walk up to you and punch you in the face and then give you $100, that would still be like messed up because I could have just given you the $100 and not punched you in the face.
Right.
But it's different for us because we're going to say, God's not saying like, hey, I'm going to punch you in the face and then give you $100 after. He's saying, hey, I want you to become the best fighter in the world. And I'm a kickboxer. I love kickboxing.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Nice.
And so this one makes a lot of sense to me. But if God's going to come up to me, and so I pay $100 a month to go to this freaking MMA gym and get punched in the face.
Right.
Because I know that it's going to make me a better fighter.
Right.
So on our view, it's not just getting punched in the face and then getting rewarded after. It's God saying, hey, I've got this plan. I know it sucks, but in order to become the best fighter that you can be, you've got to take some punches to the face and you've got to learn how to throw some back.
Yeah.
So if you go and you agree to this, then I'm going to make it worth your while. And I'm going to make you the best that you can possibly be. So you have the good, but you also have the consent to engage in the good.
Right.
So it changes everything. Those 3 propositions are kind of where I would just leave my theodicy for the purposes of this video anyway.
Yeah. No. Yeah. And I guess I might just briefly add something that shocked me reading through Volume 4 of Exploring Mormon Thought, which is where Blake Ostler addresses the problem of evil and discusses kind of some other things, is he recognizes the existence of real, genuine evils, which was kind of shocking because I thought the point of a theodicy was to explain away evil. But no, he says, no, there are some things that are so bad that like a greater good doesn't necessarily justify them. It's like straight up, like just like weighing it on a scale. They're so bad that you can't just like weigh it on a scale and it's this greater good is better and so this is justified. So like an example he uses is like, for example, a 3-year-old girl like getting run over by a car, right? Who does that really benefit, right? Like
Mhm.
obviously, there's something to be learned by everybody involved, but it also begs the question of what about the girl? How come she doesn't get to participate in a life and things like that? And I don't want to get too far into it because we got to wrap up here, but essentially, he gives some. He talks about he calls it his agape theodicy, right? Agape being one of the Greek words for love, and he talks about how love transforms these evils, and essentially we, depending on how we respond to these evils, it allows that evil not to be justified, but it's not without purpose, and so um, yeah, I don't know. I think it's pretty cool, but because of certain philosophical underpinnings in the church, um, we're able to respond to these things differently. And I feel like we may have kind of a false sense of security of how strong our arguments are because there's not really any pushback. There's not been much development in the philosophical LDS field. I feel like, and not many critics who take
Yeah,
things seriously.
I will say this: the so for a long time, church scholars have been focused on like history or
Yeah.
maybe like psychology or other things like that, like looking at what our doctrine does for like people's well-being. And
Mm.
so I think our critics have kind of mirrored that.
Mm.
So our critics dig into the history, they find problematic things about history, and
Yeah.
then they find these interesting social critiques about how the church is harmful or about how it's distasteful
Yeah.
or XYZ. So because I think our church has kind of shied away from philosophy and theology,
Yeah.
our critics are so bad at it. They
Yeah.
just are not
Yeah.
developed. Like Nemo, what's his name? Is it
Nemo the
Nemo?
Mormon. Yeah.
Yeah, he did a video kind of talking about Jacob Hansen on the Jubilee video.
Oh yeah.
And he's like, "Oh no, Jacob's wrong. All the leaders say that God is omnipotent."
Uh huh.
And I was just like, I was just baffled at how. And I mean, I'm not like he has other interesting critiques and some powerful objections, but
Yeah.
they're all from a cultural or historical standpoint.
Right.
But he just, I mean, our critics just don't know philosophy and theology. Like if he
Yeah.
knew it, he wouldn't be making because it's just such a bad argument.
No. Yeah.
But I think our critics, as we develop as our philosophers and our conceptual arguments, not just historical and pragmatic arguments develop, I think that our critics are going to sort of sharpen us a little bit.
Yeah. I hope
And
so.
just the way, like the same way that our history has gotten so much better, and the
Yeah.
church
Yeah.
has become so much more transparent
Yeah.
with our history and scholarship. Like our historical scholarship is like second
Yeah.
to none,
Yeah.
and we have so many amazing people working on it. I think that the same thing in the coming decades is going to happen to our philosophical views, because right now I totally agree. It's almost they're almost going unchallenged. Like
Right.
the only way people are able to kind of engage with our theology is taking like a fundamentalist reading of the King Follett sermon or something and saying like, oh, well, that's heresy.
Yeah.
But I really hope that I really hope we get some iron sharpening iron. I really hope
Yeah.
there's some like thoughtful philosophical critiques of our
Right.
of the strongest
Yeah.
views that we hold.
I know. Yeah. No, but yeah, I'm excited for the future of LDS philosophy, LDS theology, everything. Um.
Let's make it dope.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I guess that's about it.
We
For
solved all
today.
the
So
problems.
we solved atheism. So any atheists watching this, you're welcome. Now you believe in God. So you're
We don't know.
welcome.
We don't.
No, yeah, because yeah, I think it's also important to recognize that because I believe you can be non-resistantly and non-belief. I'm very non-judgmental when it comes to atheists or people of other religions and things because faith is a very difficult thing.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
it's not an easy thing, but just where I'm at in my life, my experiences, I feel like I would be lying. I wouldn't be living according to the best light I've received if I wasn't here doing this. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I guess that's about it for today. Thanks for coming on,
Of
Cade.
course. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.